Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Julie Abo, and I'll be introducing this first live session of Tadaima. Thank you to the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages and this incredible Tadaima month-long program. I'm very honored to be here. Tonight, or it might be your afternoon, I'd like to introduce the program, a conversation with two authors. It's called Two Nails, Alden, Hayashi, and Shirley and Higuchi. But first, let me introduce the books. Two Nails, One Love opens in New York City with the narrator, Ethan Taniguchi, a Japanese American gay man in his early 40s, awaiting the arrival of his mother from Hawaii. The two have been estranged for more than a decade, and the reunion is fraught with past grievances bubbling to the surface. Ethan's mother reluctantly reveals details of her shattered childhood, her family's imprisonment in a concentration camp in Arkansas during World War II, followed by a deportation to Japan, where she witnesses the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Ethan's past is also revealed, painful memories of a forsaken career in music and a delayed coming out at the height of the AIDS epidemic. Eventually, both mother and son come to understand the complex and subtle ways that their lives are intertwined, with the past reverberating powerfully through the present. So I look forward to discussing that with Alden. And now we'd like to show you a film trailer of Shirley's book, Setsuko's Secret and the Legacy of the Heart Mountain Incarceration. Oh, that trailer was put together by Shirley's cousin, Vanessa Yule. So thank you. So now we'd like to bring on the authors. Let's bring on Alden Hayashi. Alden Hayashi, hi Alden.
Hi.
Has been an editor and writer at Scientific American and Harvard Business Review and the MIT Sloan Management Review. After more than 30 years covering science, technology, and business, he has recently delved into his first novel, Two Nails, One Love, and we're so glad to have you here.
Thanks, Julie.
Okay, and let's bring on Shirley Ann Higuchi. Hi, Shirley. Shirley Ann Higuchi is chair of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, is the daughter of former Heart Mountain incarcerees Dr. William I. Higuchi and the late Setsuko Saito Higuchi. Her activism in the Japanese American community was inspired by her mother's deathbed admission that she was donating tens of thousands of dollars to build something at Heart Mountain, a story chronicled in her book that we're talking about tonight, Setsuko's Secret, Heart Mountain and the Legacy of the Japanese American Incarceration. Well, without much ado, I think you two will have a wonderful conversation tonight. So take it away, Shirley.
Thanks, Julie. And hi, Alden. It's good to see you again.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed reading your book, and I really notice a lot of similarities between your fiction and my nonfiction. And I thought we could sort of discuss the differences and similarities. But for my title, Setsuko's Secret, it really was a perfect title for my book because part of my experience was that I found out on my mother's deathbed when she was dying of pancreatic cancer how much Heart Mountain meant to her and her incarceration experience, although she never really talked much about it when I was growing up. And then throughout my life since her death, I've realized that it's not only a secret of my mother's, it was a secret of many families that didn't talk much about the incarceration. I sort of picked that up with your book as well. But can you tell me why you decided on Two Nails, One Love, and what does one love really mean? And can you talk about, you know, Ethan's mother's, the character, but also your own family in terms of what you knew about the incarceration?
Yeah, you know, interestingly, I was just talking with Brian Niia of Densho, and he has a funny way to put it. He said the one thing that kind of binds all of us Sanseis together is that most of us learned about the incarceration when we were in college. If not later. And that's sort of one of the defining characteristics. For me, I learned of it in bits and drabs, and it was only a social studies teacher in high school. This was when I was in the high school in the mid 70s when Roots was playing that blockbuster miniseries. And so our social studies teacher said, okay, we're all going to have to do our own Roots. That's your assignment. My father's side of the family, I didn't even have to ask him. I could just do it. My mother's side, there were these holes, and I didn't understand why one aunt was in New Jersey and why some relatives in Japan and all. And she didn't want to tell me, but you'll like this, Shirley. I told her, well, I want to get an A for this project. Like I don't want to get a C or D. And if this is incomplete, I'm not going to get a good grade. And that was the thing, you know, with parents. It's like, okay, school is so important. And then she gave me just the barest of information, just enough for me to get through the class.
Did she provide you? Was it a fun place to be? Did she kind of glamorize it, or did she, you know, exhibit any form of distress or suffering that she might have gone through at the time?
It was more an absence of emotion. It was weird now when I think about it. And she referred to it as camp. I think your mother did as well. And just and I think with your mother, I recall you saying that the name Heart Mountain, you know, it just has such a you know, positive sort of emotion to it. For my mother, I knew she had been in Arkansas, and it was a camp, and yeah, it was an absence of emotion that was striking to me. And now thinking about it decades later.
So why did you settle on Two Nails, One Love as the title for the book?
Oh, so the two nails are the mother and son, and it comes from that Japanese saying, "Teru kugi wa utareru," the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. And throughout the novel, what mother and son slowly begin to realize is that they're much more similar than they ever thought, and that they're both nails in their own ways. And it's with that understanding that they're finally able to sort of bridge that gap and forgive each other for things that happened in the past. And that's the one love, the love between mother and child, which it's always there, but sometimes you forget it's there, or it gets so obfuscated, I suppose, by all this other stuff.
Right. And you and I had a chance to talk earlier, and I got to know you better through our conversations. And after I finished reading your book and I got to the end of the book, the epilogue, you mentioned, well, the one thing that really isn't true is that my mom never met Senator Inouye, but I want to put that in. By the way, I've met Senator Inouye several times. And I'm thinking, like, that's the only thing that's not true. And then it made me think, well, maybe everything else in the book was true. I mean, maybe that character Ethan, and it was, you said that it was easier in some ways to write it as fiction as opposed to nonfiction. But how much of Ethan really is you? I mean, if you don't feel comfortable telling me, you don't have to. But
No,
I would say like 80% or.
Let me put it this way, Shirley. I think the way that Ethan thinks and the way he views the world and his reaction to events that happen are very much me. But everything that happened to him may not have happened to me. And I had to simplify the story in writing fiction because I really wanted certain themes to not get clouded over. So for example, Ethan is an only child. And I thought that was the best way to tell this story, because then you just have this very nuclear unit, father, mother, son, and the dynamics there. Whereas in real life, I had three brothers. But I thought writing about all of that, it might start to muddy the message. And my mother's family, she had 9 siblings. But in the book, I narrowed down Ethan's mother's family to 1 sister and 1 brother. I just thought it was just easier to streamline it. And that way the messages would be clearer and more powerful. I think that was my intention.
Right. Well, I mean, I noticed a lot of similarities, I think, between both of our lives. And I think a lot of it was embedded in your book. And I was talking to Julie this morning, going over some notes. I said, Alden and I have a lot in common. He has 3 brothers, and he was an only gay boy, I assume. And I'm the only girl in my family. So in many ways, maybe we sort of absorb the same kind of cultural or societal effects of that dynamic. But did your brothers actually read your book yet? Or, I mean, how did they react to this book?
They haven't read it yet. They haven't expressed interest in it yet. And I thought at one point that they would never read it. But I wrote a short story earlier this year that was published in the Baltimore Review. And my brothers actually read it. And they both liked it. So I think they might read the novel. I have 2 nephews, though, that I've been trying to encourage them to learn more about our Nikkei history. And one of them's reaction when I told him, I wrote this book. And actually, I was telling him that when I die, I want to leave the copyright to you and your brother. And this will be yours, and his reaction was, I could tell he's thinking, okay, I suppose I have to read it now because I'm going to own the copyright. And his reaction was, how many pages is it? So I had to tell him it's a short novel. It's a short novel.
That's good.
Yeah.
So you and I talked earlier about the Sansei effect, and I have a whole chapter that talks about the multi-generational trauma that I believe was passed through the Nisei to the Sansei, our generation. And I want to get a feeling from you in terms of what you identified about the Sansei effect, not only in your writing, but in your own life. How did that term affect you? And what does that mean to you as you now completed your book?
Yeah. Shirley, I really wish I could have read your book before I wrote my book, because my book would have been so much better, because you were able to articulate and define this term and in such a succinct way. And the light bulb went off in my head. And really, when I was reading your book, I think it was last February or March, this kind of shiver went down my spine. I thought, oh my gosh, this is what my book is all about. Although I couldn't have articulated it until I read your book. And it's so odd that I have to read someone else's book to realize what my own book was about. It's ironic, but really, you gave us a term and you defined it so well. This, striving, this relentless striving for perfection, where we know we can achieve it, and that's our lives.
Yeah. So, and the other thing, I don't know if it's okay for me to share this with the audience. You and I both had three brothers, and my brother had died under mysterious circumstances in a car accident, and your brother had passed away through suicide. So, when you sort of read my book and you read about my experiences with my brother dying and the stress that he was under, being the oldest Sansei son, so to speak, how did that identify with your own experiences with your brother that passed?
Surely it was very tough to read that section of your book, because it brought back a lot of memories. And yeah, our brothers, very hard-driven people, very, very what do you call it? Type A, yeah. And just they were very much a product of the Sansei effect, I think. Well, my brother anyway. I don't want to speak for your brother, but and it was hard. It was his suicide was tough on my parents, and I think I told you a while ago. I think my parents raised us sort of with the Sansei effect, to do well in school, do and just study hard and this and that. So they sort of had the Sansei effect knob cranked up to 10 when we were young. And I suppose that was good because it focused us. I always assumed I was going to college. It was never an option, and so when we were young, I suppose there were good aspects of it. But for that brother, when he started suffering depression as an adult, and we all know that stress can exacerbate depression. And my parents kept on saying, don't work so hard. Are you sure this job? They're working you too hard and all. I think my parents would have loved to have turned the knob down from 10 and just bring it down to 4 or 3 and they couldn't. And I think it's ingrained in us. I see it in myself, and I don't like it. And I'm sure you do too, or you kind of have to pull yourself back and say, wait a minute, this doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to,
It's that drive to sort of fulfill a belief or an image that's been sort of ingrained throughout your whole childhood, and I was curious. I know Ethan's love of music was something that he really wanted to pursue. What was your outlet? What else did you want to be that you think that your parents would have objected to?
Well, music. I also actually, that part is very autobiographical. I did play the oboe, and I was pretty good as a high school student, and I did want to go to a music conservatory, and my parents were very much against it. And I've been thinking about the Sansei effect since you and I last talked. It's bizarre in a way, Shirley, that the two things I love to do most, music and writing, are two things that you cannot achieve perfection. I mean, you can't. You just can't. Whereas the field that I ended up in for a while, engineering, and in the book, Ethan is an engineer and becomes a computer programmer. In that sense, not that you can write a perfect computer program, but you can write a good one that will do what it was supposed to do and feel like, oh, I did a great job, and it works, and this and that. Whereas with music and writing, it's always, oh my God, this could be better if I did this or I did that. So it's ironic that the two things that I love are things that the Sansei effect that run so much counter to.
Right.
Yeah.
How similar is Ethan's mother and your own mother in that terms? Are pretty similar, would you say?
Yes. Same as with me, I think, Shirley. I think the way Ethan's mother thinks, her view of the world and how she reacts to situations are pretty much how I perceive my mother to be.
Mm-hmm.
As well as I knew my mother. And of course, there was a lot I didn't know about my mother, but that's how I perceive her to be. So she's like the Ethan character in terms of their reactions, just how they think and their interact. That's very much based on real life. But I think I told you that it was easier for me to write her character as a younger girl when she was sent to the Jerome concentration camp in Arkansas. In real life, my mother was 16, and I brought the age down of that character to, I think, 6 or 7. So there are differences. Yeah.
Well, one of the similarities, and I kind of saw this evolution in your book, was that the anger that Ethan had, and I had anger as well, and I assume, Alden, you did too, in terms of the controlling nature or the expectations that maybe your mother might have had of you and my mother had of me. I mean, some of the stuff, actually, when I look back in retrospect, it didn't even make sense. Like, she would have an expectation. I go, that doesn't even make sense. What do you mean, Yeah. And so it's funny how you do this in your book, where we kind of, I don't want to say villainize, but we criticize our mothers, and we're, in your case, with Ethan, I felt like Ethan was being suffocated and controlled. Mm-hmm. He felt that he couldn't easily come out. He didn't know what the retribution would be. He suppressed his love of music because it didn't fit the perfect image of the Japanese American Sansei son: be a doctor, be a lawyer, be a scientist, be an engineer. So I just thought that it was interesting towards the end of the book, you sort of brought it full circle and realized that your mother really loved you. I mean, she really, truly loved you in her own way and cared about you, or cared about Ethan, I should say. And I'm wondering, during that process, did you feel some guilt when you were writing this? If you were identifying with your mother and yourself as being Ethan, did you feel guilty that you were sort of showing these negative attributes about your mother? And then I know at the end you sort of brought it in a positive way.
You mean in real life or in?
Well, I mean, in both. I think that I have a feeling it might have happened in real life with you, right? Sort of.
I think my brothers and I, we talked a lot about this after our mother passed, and we think that she knew how much we appreciated her, and we tried to show it in ways, but we didn't always find the right ways. And I'll give you one example. My mother was not a materialistic person. I can't think of a single piece of jewelry, Shirley, that she bought for herself. And anything nice that we would try to give her, clothes or jewelry, or she would maybe wear once or twice, and then, kind of to humor us. And then So that wasn't how to show her our love. She showed us her love, I realize now, by cooking. She was a great cook. So all our favorite dishes, she would cook and all. And I don't know if we ever figured out the way to show her our love in a way that, but I think that even though she didn't use a lot of our gifts and whatnot, that she still, she appreciated that we were thinking about it. We're trying to, I remember once I had a blouse made for her out of antique kimono silk, and it was beautiful, and it fit her perfectly. It was custom made. She wore it once.
Wow.
And so I think she did know, or maybe that's how my brothers and I comfort ourselves by saying that she did know this. How about with your mother?
Well, I think there was a lot of similarities. I mean, my mother, I think her incarceration experience was sort of exhibited by this real constant need to move a lot and buy different homes and move into different homes. And even after a while, when it really didn't make sense, flipping homes. And I wondered always if that was a product of her incarceration, that she was forced out of her home at a very young age into Heart Mountain Camp. And when you lose that kind of control, and, home becomes a very important thing. And we actually found out later, and my aunt had shared this with me, that even when my mother was in camp and they knew they were going to leave, she had home building books sent to her barrack about how to pick out the perfect home and how to decorate the perfect home. And, so it was something at a very young age that had an impact on her. And I think it gave her a sense of empowerment to be able to go out and buy a home. And I do recall, and this is I think it's in the book, I've told the story so many times, that when I was in third grade in Ann Arbor, Michigan, I remember my dad came home and he said, "Is anything new?" And then my mom turned to him and said, "I bought a home." And I was only 8 years old and I was sitting there like, that is really messed up. You don't know how to buy homes without telling your husband. But she went out and bought a lot of homes without telling my dad. I mean, a lot, like 20, so it really was an obsession. So, but it's really weird. It's like you're a kid, you're growing up in this situation and you almost think it's kind of normal.
Yeah.
So I think, I thought everyone did that until I realized, why have you lived in the same house for 40 years? Or why have you lived in the same house for 20 years? And so, it's just pretty crazy.
Yeah. So Shirley, but at age 8, you kind of realized that there was something more to this habit of your mom.
Yeah, I didn't know at that time that it was tied to incarceration. I just know that it was unusual. I noticed that no one else's mom was going out and buying homes without their husband's knowledge, But my father was very dependent on my mother, and this is the reason why when she died in 2005, it was such a huge adjustment for us, because my dad had never taken out the garbage. I'd never seen him write a check. He didn't know, he didn't know how to use the dishwasher. I mean, he was very dependent on my mother. He went out and worked and did all the research and was very successful. And my mom pretty much, ran the household, soup to nuts. So it's really weird. Growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, it's like there were no other Asians and Japanese Americans. You were either black or white when I grew up in Ann Arbor, in the 1970s, and went to college in the early 80s. And I really remember that I remember thinking, why would anyone ever want to be a guy? Here I had 3 brothers and a dad who were relatively quiet scientists. And my mom seemed to be able to get whatever she wanted and sort of, was in the wild, wild west, buying this, going there. Hey, let's go shopping. And it was just sort of a little excessive and probably at the time living beyond her means. But it really never struck me why anyone would ever want to be a guy. It just never occurred, because I was like, well, you don't get any clothes. You always wear hand-me-downs. If you're a girl, you get 3 dresses instead of 1 pair of pants. And so it was a very unusual upbringing for me. And I think when you grow up in an unusual upbringing, it takes a lot longer to figure out why certain things happen. Henceforth, if you read my book, it's kind of like going through a psychotherapy process and wondering, gee, I wonder why my mom bought and sold houses all the time. Or I wonder why she was so controlling, or she wanted to pick out my friends and pick out what I wore. And she had a huge need to remind me that I needed to act like a lady. I mean, that was like a constant thing. Was I never was ladylike enough, you know, and you know, I just was basically who I was. So, I don't know. I guess in some ways I was always a nail sticking out, you know, pretty much all the time. I still am.
And Shirley, in terms of when you went to college and you decided what to major in, and I know it, you know, you got interested in the law and all, did your mother or father try to guide that decision in any way, or were you pretty free to pursue whatever interest that you
Well,
had?
that's a very difficult question because, and I didn't put this in the book because I never really wondered. I never thought it was. That's another weird thing about being a Sansei affected person. You can never really tell when somebody's telling you something, whether it's true or not. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, you know, when people are telling you stuff, you're like, why am I wondering whether they're making the story up? But yet we're gullible and we believe everything else. It doesn't make sense. So it's kind of a weird situation. But I remember my always go-to reaction is sometimes, oh, that can't be true, which is very reactive and a product of the Sansei effect. But I remember the girl across the street said to me that her mother told her, and this is when I was in high school, that my mom said, well, if Shirley can't become a lawyer or a doctor, it doesn't matter because she can marry one. so I, you know, again, it's that little thing of trying, you know, so I think being a girl and not the same kind of pressures that you might have been being a boy, I think the expectation at that time for Japanese American Sansei girls and young women, you know, the backup plan is if you can't get into law school, you can always like marry some rich lawyer that works, you know, in DC or New York. I mean, that is a backup plan. I mean, I guess it could be a backup plan for a guy too. But I think my mom always thought about who I would marry first as opposed to what I would be. But for me, you know, just based on my own experiences growing up, I mean, I knew when I was already in high school that I was going to be a lawyer. I was already planning like why and how I was going to achieve that. I didn't want to become a doctor because I wasn't good in sciences, but I knew I could argue my way out of anything if I had to. So, but my mom and I kind of butted. We got along. We had a lot of fun together, but we also butted heads together. You know, and I remember we were sitting in my grandmother's house, who was living in Washington, D.C. at the time. And it's the first time I think I really broke my mother's heart. You know, I didn't put this in, I should have probably put this in the book, but I just felt my mom and I were so different. You know, I mean, we were just so different. She cared about appearances and I didn't. She cared about X, Y, and Z and I didn't. And I remember once I turned to her and I said, you know what? I would have never been your friend. If you were in high school with me, I would have never been your friend. I looked at her face and it was just like it's almost like
how old were you, Shirley, when you
I think I might have been like 17 or 16 or 18. I don't know. I might have even been in college, but I remember, you know, I remember there was always this need for me to your resistance was to recoil, I think, and be pull back. And what mine was to just take out, I was, you know, kind of taking out the daggers and poking her because that was my way of sort of getting back at her was to, you know, to poke at her and give her a hard time on stuff. So a little bit different reaction than maybe how you reacted, like when your mom was trying to.
Yeah. You know, I think, Shirley, this is just a very broad generalization, but I feel that the most complicated relationships are between mothers and daughters. I think between mothers and sons is a little easier. Fathers and sons can be a little tricky, and mothers and you know, and fathers and daughters. But I think there's something about the mother-daughter relationship that is just there's just more layers to it, or you know, so to navigate that is just trickier.
Well, but being the only daughter with 3 boys, though, I mean, that really kind of jumps the stakes up a lot in a Japanese American family. I mean, that could either go 2 different ways. It either goes the Shirley Higuchi way, or it goes to the being more submissive and passive daughter. So, but I think the fact that I didn't have a sister probably altered the dynamics in the family strongly, because I was the only go-to female identification that my mother had, which puts its own kind of pressure on the Sansei daughter. You know what I mean? Like being the oldest Sansei son could have that same sort of effect.
Yeah.
So,
Shirley, you mentioned a few times that things that you were thinking to put in the book but decided not to. And all. Was there sort of a common theme or things that you chose not to put in versus things? Was there sort of a line that you, I don't know, privacy, or that you were very conscious not to cross? Or
I think with respect to my family history and the experiences of my brother's death and the impact, and me describing my mother's personality early on, I think I didn't really hold back. As a matter of fact, the first manuscript that I wrote didn't have enough information about me. So the publisher, and as well as an agent that I was working with at the time, said, you need to make this about you. And, typical Japanese American, we don't want to talk about ourselves. So it's like, I said, oh, great. Now how am I going to do this? So, literally, when I talk about this book, it was not that I've been through psychotherapy. I'm very familiar with therapy services because I work for the American Psychological Association. But I really felt that if you were to define what it's like to truly go through psychotherapy, for me, it was writing this book. And it was very, I never really fully recovered from my mother's death when I was writing this book. So I literally was healing every step of the way and telling more and more about my own experiences. And that was what, my publisher and other folks had really pressed me to do. So a lot of what I would do is I remember standing in the kitchen, and I'm working with my partner, Ray Locker, who did a lot of research and support of me while I was writing this book. And I would just start talking about like all the horrible things that I could imagine my mom would have went through, and talking about my mother's death. And I would end up crying like all the time. It was just like constant. And then I would take the manuscript on the airplane, and I'm sitting next to Dick Cheney, or a couple of times I run into Senator Simpson on the way to Wyoming, and I'm like crying, after 3 glasses of wine, I'm crying, and people are looking at me and saying, are you okay? But it was literally going through the process of really bearing your soul, and the need to really make sure that what you're saying is accurate. Just because you're writing a book, it's not a free-for-all, and you had a lot more leeway because yours was fiction, but I had to really make sure. And I think I'd mentioned this to you, and we talked about that I had said, I had to make sure this book was bulletproof. And it really wasn't about my family issues that I mean, I had to be honest and direct and clear, but I had to make sure that all the historical narratives and the research was accurate. Because I'll tell you one thing, the Japanese American community can be really critical when you do something wrong and they don't like it. I mean, it just starts and then it doesn't stop. And, so I had to make sure that, at least from a historical perspective, that it was well documented, and everything, the dates were correct and all that.
Shirley, by the way, that is one thing I loved about your book, is that you describe the camps very well, just the daily life and some of the dynamics in it, the resistors, etc. That part is so well done. But what I really love too was that you talk about what happened before the camps. You give us this context to understand how we ended up with Executive Order 9066. And that is so important, I think, because if we want to, not repeat these kinds of mistakes, we have to understand the context that gets us there. And that's one thing I thought your book did so well, that it provided that all the factors leading up to it. And so you had that breath that I loved. I thought you did a great job.
Okay, so I just wanted to read a passage from my book that I identified. I know we're going to have to go to questions probably in about 5 minutes or so. And when I read your book, I said, oh my God, here's a connection. And let me give the audience a little backdrop. When I was writing Setsuko's Secret, and I picked this up in Alden's book as well, we were very critical of our mothers. We felt that we were being stifled and pressured to be a certain mold and meet all these expectations. And I know I started feeling a little guilty about, being so critical. And so it really hit me after researching all this and experiencing my mother, how much I did appreciate and love her and how special she was. And I think, Alden, you also brought this out in your book. So I was talking about my mother after we had built the museum, and she had already been passed away for a while. And I talk about I had been able to get to know my mother in a different way since she left, a way that transcends her role as a protective mother who orchestrated our family dynamics. She was and is a beautiful, smart, and loyal daughter, mother, wife, sister, and friend to many. She could have been a brilliant lawyer or had her own career, but the family demands of supporting first her father's dreams and then the dreams of my father and me kept her too busy to see her own dreams. And the only sadness I feel from time to time is that she's not able to see what we've done at Heart Mountain. And we actually have a museum there today, which she dreamt of. And then I was looking at your book on page 177, and you said, to me, my mother, she's beautiful and graceful beyond words, and her mind is as sharp as a samurai katana. Her abundance, intelligence, she could easily have been anything she wanted. Yet what she wanted most was to start a family and have a child. And I think what you were saying here was exactly what I was writing about, that, it's that guilt, that Sansei guilt, where you realize they put all this energy into you and into me and into Ethan in your book. And wow, they're smarter than us. They could have been anything, but yet they chose to be our mothers. And I just thought that that was so amazing. And I wanted to end with one other thing, and people were really quite amazed at this, is that it's very common that the Nisei mothers, even though they exhibited all this protective love towards us, they never said, I love you. And I noticed that the next passage in your book, at one point, Ethan turns to his mother and says, I love you. And the mother character of Ethan in your book, it didn't seem to respond to that, which is very common.
Yeah.
So, was that a term that you used freely when you were growing up to your parents? I love you, Mom. I love you, Dad.
No, not at all, Shirley. Yeah. And it was only after my brother's suicide, and if anything good could have come from that, it was just this greater appreciation of my brothers and I for our parents, and I think for our parents for us. And we were saying, I love you more often. And we never used to do that until my brother killed himself. So yeah, maybe we were unusual in that way, that we had that such a traumatic experience to get us to that spot. But yeah, it was one nice thing that happened.
Yeah, that sort of happened with when my brother died, that I saw a softening of my parents and more physical love and interaction and expression of love. But that's it's interesting how much we have in common in that way. And I'm sure many other Sanseis out there are saying, yeah, you guys are saying things that they're experiencing as well. Well, I'm going to turn it. We're at 8:44, so I'm going to turn it over to Julie to start the questions.
Oh, what a wonderful conversation. I mean, really, truly, two nails and one love. So thank you both. I just so appreciate that so much. And I just want to reiterate to everyone out there that Alden's book's coming out September 16th. So the website I see was dropped there. We could drop it again, Jamp. www.blackrosewriting.com. It's a fabulous book. And there's Shirley's book that came out last year, and it's still available if you can buy it at the Heart Mountain, Wyoming website. So please go there. And it's wonderful to read these together. Really, really. And okay, so I want to go to the questions now. So we have one from Haruka Sakaguchi. How do you think the Sansei effect informs the way you interact with your own children or younger members of your family, like nieces and nephews, etc.?
Well, I could take that one because I've actually thought about it. I do have two kids, a boy and a girl. Those bad habits are hard to shake, and it's taken me. Well, I think working on this book really helped me a lot. It's like to really be able to sit back and say, what is in the best interest of my child? I mean, how much of this is really about my need for you to be successful and really your need to be happy? And so I think that now I think I'm at a really good place with that. But I kind of exhibited a lot of my mother's tendencies very early on, the education, the grades, and having these expectations, and what they would do with their lives. And, I think that I'm very lucky in terms of where I am with my kids now. And if it ain't broke, don't try to fix it. So I pretty much let go of that. But I think it's hard to shake those habits of being brought under the Nisei effect and being a Sansei daughter, to be honest.
For me, I don't have any children, so I sort of had the luxury to be the uncle, the sort of fun uncle. So with my two nephews, I was always on the lookout for their interests. When one of them took up the trumpet in band, I just, I wanted to play with him. We played duets. And when both started drawing, and both are very good artists, I went out, bought them the most expensive, professional pencils, and tried to encourage that type of creativity that my brothers and I didn't have that from our parents. But just in case that was what they loved and what they wanted to pursue. And ironically, Shirley, they both ended up becoming engineers.
Oh, okay. So the key is not to withhold the creativity, but to support it and let them find their way. But no, it's interesting when you're with young people, how you act towards them when you realize that you've had a different kind of upbringing. But what it did do for me was it taught me what not to do with my kids. And I'm still learning to do that, what not to do.
Yeah, so it's like you have a self-awareness.
Right.
Okay, so I think we're ready for the next question from David Fujioka. It says, Alden, Shirley, where did you fall in birth order amongst your siblings? And did that influence you growing up?
So I'm the fourth of four boys, and it was a huge influence. And I am so grateful. I've thanked my eldest brother a lot because I think if I had been the oldest boy, coming out would have been 10 times as difficult. But I was fortunate, I was fourth already. So, when I came out, my parents were not happy by any means, but at least they had three other brothers, who are straight. And so they kind of thought, okay, Alden can do his thing. But birth order was a huge factor. And I am so grateful that I was not the eldest.
Yeah, you're lucky you were the youngest.
Yeah.
I had an older brother. He's the one that died. And then there was me, the only girl. And then I had two younger brothers. So in many ways, I guess I became the oldest sort of after my brother died. But I was already like 26 and he was 28. So I think anything that was already intact already in our family unit, it was already laid out. So I think being second and third is a good place to be. I don't know if I'd want to be last, but because then you really get the hand-me-downs. But I guess I'm sort of like the only girl, and I had sort of older sibling traits.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, another question from Richard Ito. Any thoughts about the influence of growing up in Hawaii versus continental US? I believe Alden is from Hawaii and Shirley is continental.
Yeah. And Shirley, I gotta say, that was another huge surprise for me that, I grew up in Honolulu where almost all my friends were Asian Americans, and most were Japanese Americans. And I know that, you grew up in Michigan where there weren't that many Japanese Americans around. And yet I felt this connection with you reading your book that we grew up in totally different environments. And yet because of our nuclear family and those dynamics, I feel, like I know you. And
Yeah. Well, that's the beauty of growing up in Ann Arbor, pretty much functioning in the white world my whole life. Even like I went to Georgetown. I remember a Hispanic law student came up to me and said, "Shirley, why don't you hang around with the other Asians?" And I said, "You mean like the Asians? Like you mean the Japanese Americans from Hawaii? Like you're talking about the guy who is from Japan and the Korean girl who speaks no English. I mean, it's just because you got an Asian face, that means you got to hang around with the rest of the Asians." But I really noticed straight out when I met those Japanese Americans from Hawaii, how much different their personalities were from me. We were they were just so much nicer and happier and lighthearted and and I wasn't like that. I came from Michigan, 45 minutes from Detroit. So I was pretty rough and tumble. And I had a lot of African American and white friends. And, that's how I'm raised. That's what I'm used to.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't about to just hang out with Asians just because they were there. I hung out with who I felt comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
So, but, it's not my fault that I grew up in Michigan, right? I mean,
Yeah.
You can't blame me for that. You can blame me for other stuff, but.
Well, if I could insert a question that's related to that. So how do you both feel over the arc of your lives to now and where you've lived regionally? How do you identify with your Japanese American identity? Go ahead, Alden, you can go first.
It's sort of a long story, but in my 20s and 30s, I very much identified primarily as a gay man. I think because I was coming out and that was a big struggle, and also because of the AIDS epidemic, and this was during the worst of it, and I felt very vulnerable and threatened, and there was a lot of this this homophobic vitriol, and being Japanese American to me was sort of like a footnote in my existence. And now, Julie, it's just gone completely 180 because, and I don't know, I think a lot of it is because now I feel more threatened as an Asian American. That I feel more likely to be assaulted, to be blamed for COVID, or to be assaulted because I'm Asian American, more so than I feel threatened to be gay bashed. And maybe that's why I just feel this stronger identification with being Japanese American. And also because I think I just understand and I appreciate my parents, the whole Nikkei experience, what my grandparents went through immigrating. I'm just, at 62, Julie, I think I'm finally growing up. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's really weird. I mean, I actually had the same kind of reaction that Alden had. I mean, he thought that he was dealing with being gay as sort of the primary factor, and the Japanese part was sort of secondary. But that I felt like I was struggling as a female in a male-dominated world, being a lawyer. I mean, like I felt like the law firms and the legal community wasn't ready for me at age 26 or 27. And I felt like I was, I don't want to use the term sexually harassed, but I felt like I was viewed as a sexual object in some ways. And I felt like I was more or less trying to defend my position as a woman more than I was trying to defend my position as an Asian back in the 1980s and 90s. Because and some people don't even consider Asians being disadvantaged minorities.
Yeah.
I mean, people they don't necessarily say I'm white, but they sure as heck don't say, well, Shirley's a minority.
Yeah.
So I don't get any special treatment from being a minority, but I think I'm getting a little bit more now that Asian violence is coming and people are now looking at me as a leader to help in that area. But yeah.
So Shirley, it's interesting to me that we both sort of identified with the parts of us that felt most threatened at the time. Yeah.
There weren't any women. Like I was the only female associate in my class. There were other female lawyers, but in my entry class, I was the only woman. And I felt more protective of being a female than I did of being protecting my Asianness.
Yeah.
More material for writing. Hey, so we've got Ken Mochizuki in the audience, another writer.
Oh,
so this is related to what we just talked about. He said, is the lack of knowledge of our own heroes when growing up, our role models and our history included in the Sansei effect? So you had that lack of knowledge of those role models.
Oh, I think it had a huge effect. I mean, I think the only access that I really had to really any information when I was growing up was the Pacific Citizen magazine that Jay Sell puts out, as well as the book Nisei, The Quiet American that Bill Hosokawa wrote, who was incarcerated at Heart Mountain. And it was very bent towards JCL and the 442 and the military and didn't really even talk about the resistors. So I think that those books in JCL at the time really glamorized the role of the Japanese Americans during World War II. And what happens is it sort of develops this feeling of not being completely whole in your perspective. You know, if you get one side of the story and you don't hear the other side of the resistors, you tend to over kind of glamorize what the Japanese Americans were like during World War II. And everyone turned out, you know, okay. And we were war heroes and we all lived happily ever after. We know that's not true. So I think that was huge in the Sansei effect. But, you know, my hero was Daniel Inouye because he was the only person I had any information on. Plus, he was great, too, you know.
I have a distinct memory, Julie. When I wanted to become a professional musician, I used to watch in Hawaii. They'd always show once a week the Boston Pops, and I'd always watch it. And my parents, when they were very much set against my becoming a classical musician, I remember my mother looking at the TV and saying, "Okay, how many Asians do you see in this orchestra?" And there weren't any. And then, so years later, when I gave up that dream and I wanted to become a writer, same thing. My mother, how many Asians do you see in the New York Times? And at that time, there was one though, Michiko Kakutani, who was the arts critic. So there was one, but she said, "Yeah, do you see a lot? Do you see?" And so yeah, I wish there were more role models in all fields when I was growing up, and I think that would have made it easier. And for my parents, and Shirley, you talk about this, they need this box and that you fit in it and whatnot. When they don't see, Japanese American writers at the New York Times or at the classical musicians or whatnot, they cannot. The box. It's like, okay, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't. You want to be a classical musician? I can't put this in a box. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a couple more minutes here, and they're both writing related questions, but let's go to Karen Lowe's question. She says, and this is great because I hope everybody who's watching knows that Alden has 3 writing sessions coming up in Tadaima. So you should really join him for those sessions. Karen asks, Alden and Shirley, you both work full-time while managing to write your books. What advice would you give to Nikkei who want to write but do not know how to get started? So Karen, I think you should go to one of his writing workshops.
Yes. The writing workshops are Tuesday nights, East Coast time, starting the Tuesday after Labor Day and for 3 weeks. It's tough. And surely it's probably a lot tougher for you, with the demanding career you have, to find that time to write, set aside that time. For me, I went working half-time in my my real job, and so that I'd write this. And actually, it was the pandemic and the slowdown that when a lot of my freelance work was starting to dry up, and I thought, oh, okay, now I can go more full steam, finishing this novel and all. But it's tough. It's
my recommendation, and this is kind of like what happened to me. I mean, I'm lucky because I have the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, staff that's always been very supportive of this book. Julie has been, and Ray Locker's been supportive, and my previous assistants that I worked with, Helen Yoshida and Hannah Mariyama. So I started working on this book right when I really joined the foundation. And don't worry about what the information looks like. Start interviewing your relatives, start talking to people. I've even tell this to my cousin's daughter, like, write everything down. If you don't start documenting the information now, you're not going to have it 5 years from now. So just dump everything in a notebook, write everything down, put down your thoughts. Half of it may not make sense, but you'll get to that as soon as you can. But document and interview your grandparents if they're still alive, your aunts, your uncles, or whoever, and start asking the hard questions. I mean, ask them really. That's what I ended up doing. I mean, I didn't always get the answer I needed, but I still asked the questions.
Or Shirley, I also say that if you really don't like writing, why not record? Do interviews with your relatives and record their answers, and so later you can go back to the recording, but at least you have a record of it, that should something happen to that relative, you have that memory. So,
yeah, the recording is incredible, and Shirley's has so many recorded interviews, but to hear the voices, I think that's so important. It's so important, not just to see it written. Yeah, so wonderful. Okay, we have another one from Ginny Yamamoto, and I'm sorry, Ginny, if I'm pronouncing this wrong, Swaxel. She says, we commend you, both of you, to share these books. Do you think being Sansei made it easier, perhaps she means than a Nisei, I'm sure, for you to write these books?
Not really. Because the problem with being a Sansei is you don't have the information that your parents didn't share with you. So you don't have the depth and the range of the incarceration experience. And then if you grow up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, you're doubly insulated and you really then have nothing to compare about. I think it was very, very challenging. I think that, we would hope that the Nisei could have written more books about it, right? Because they were there and, they were old enough to know what happened. But because the Nisei are the quiet Americans, they didn't talk about it. That was double jeopardy too. So I think being both made it hard. I think the ones that might have an easier time are maybe the next generation, my kids, and maybe even their kids. That's why we have to document as much as possible so they can use it. How about you, Alden?
Yeah, well, Shirley, I was going to say, I love what you did with Setsuko's Secret, because I think you had the same problem I did, where you didn't have enough from your mother or both your parents to do a book on them or anything. And I had that problem, which is why I turned to fiction. But you solved it in another way, which I thought was brilliant, where you added these other families and told their stories, which had a double benefit of you had a broader experience that you covered, and you were able to tell this full story through telling it through 4 or 5 families. I didn't think to do that. Like I said, if I had read your book first, I might have written a very different book. Because I had this lack of information, and so what I did was then turn it into my book, sort of a book on the Sansei and the relationship with the Nisei parent and the Sansei child not getting the information and having this, trying to break through, trying to understand the parent when you don't know what happened to that parent during World War II. So yeah, tough writing as a Sansei.
Yeah,
and I think that the Yonsei are wanting to know those stories, because there's this information gap, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's so important. Both of you have done such wonderful work, and I think it's really valuable for the younger generations.
Yeah.
And you're inspiring us all. So thank you so much. Thank you both so much for sharing so much tonight. And again, September 16th, Alden will be excited to watch the workshop, and I hope you'll be posting that so we can also repost it and celebrate with you. We have to have like a online celebration or something.
Yeah,
And
thank
Shirley's
you.
book is out and doing really well, and we're excited. Shirley, keep buying her book too.
Yes.
And we just hope to hear more from both of you. I think there's some more books ready to be.
We have to do an in person.
Yeah,
have a reception afterwards.
Yeah,
a dance party.
Absolutely. I want to thank the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages for this wonderful event, Kimiko Mar. And I also want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. Now, this recording will be on the same link. And so I encourage you to share it with your friends and family and your colleagues out there. And watch out for more programming. Again, watch out for those workshops. I see that they've been dropped in the chat there. So join Alden for the writing workshops.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Julie. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah.
You worked really hard. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
お疲れ様でした。
Yeah.
Thank you.